Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. With a new US-led peace talks format proposed in Miami, Ukraine, Russia and possibly European envoys could be at the same table. Kyiv is cautious. Moscow remains firm on territorial demands, and the EU has opted to fund Ukraine's defence via a €90 billion loan rather than unlocking frozen Russian assets. Joshua Burgin, founder of the Alliance for Global Security, joins us to unpack what this could mean for peace in Ukraine and European security. Joshua, welcome back to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
We've been having talks after talks after talks. This is the first time that everyone, including the Europeans, are there. And the Russians and Ukrainians are supposedly involved in this kind of four-way meeting. Is the format going to make a difference?
Well, it certainly is a stark contrast from Vladimir Putin and President Donald Trump meeting in person. I think this is, while slightly different, a bit more reflective of the classic ways in which junior staff, underlings, interlocutors meet together, formulate the scope of what's possible before bringing a potential deal to the senior players for ratification.
But what is possible here? I mean, it seems like everyone's at an impasse. Russia hasn't taken a single step back in terms of territorial demands. Ukraine says it can't do that. It's unconstitutional. So it seems as though the fighting's just going to go on and Russia's just paying lip service to the whole process. Your thoughts?
Well, certainly Russia has not backed away at all from its core underpinnings, and many of us believe that their whole hope is to reestablish some form of the prior Soviet Union, and Ukraine is but one step towards that pathway. That it's but one step, and its compliance would put Russia on NATO borders. As a practical matter, yes, Russia hasn't backed down, but Ukraine hasn't backed down either. And I was listening to an analyst just yesterday who said, in all likelihood, President Zelensky couldn't back down if he wanted to, as he has a military that's in the field and fighting and may or may not respond to a normative line of commands from the presidency. I think this puts everybody a bit at an impasse. And so some of these, let's say, quieter dialogues outside of a national capital is probably designed on its very face to sort of test the scope of what is possible, given that at the current moment nothing seems possible.
But I mean, Ukraine has compromised. It has agreed that it won't join NATO as long as it gets some security guarantees. Russia hasn't even done that. Also, let's not forget, Russia is the aggressor here. You know, it's taken over 20% of Ukrainian territory. Why should Ukraine back down?
I don't think it should. In fact, I'm not sure I would have agreed with them to forego the notion of NATO. I think that's a reflection more of the weakness of NATO's internal intestinal fortitude to stand firm against Russia. I mean, Russia is a diminished military strength. It's a diminished economy. Its population is in free fall. And as myself, along with many others, are watching and seeing that the longer this goes on, the more likely it is that China is going to end up taking over vast parts of Russia, if not directly, then certainly as a matter of fait accompli, as sort of remote control.
Right. Okay. So Putin's got his back to against the wall, but that's going to make him more desperate, isn't it? Is he likely to kind of escalate in other ways, hybrid warfare, perhaps even the nuclear option?
Well, Mr. Kumar, I'm of the view that Putin's back has been against the wall now for so long, much because of mistakes he made. No one forced him to attack a neighbor that was not attacking him. No one forced him to go long and deep into something that frankly, he just didn't have the resources to control. This said, I think probably the only way this ultimately gets resolved is when the Russians wake up and understand that Mr. Putin, as the leader of the country, probably needs to be retired through whatever means they deem necessary. I'm actually surprised that we're not seeing calls from the international stage, for Mr. Putin to step aside and for cooler, more rational Russian heads to step into his place.
Right. Well, the international community would then be blamed for regime change, which is another, can of worms. Now, moving.
Allow me to disagree just slightly. There's a profound difference between regime change, which involves, a massive amount of the instruments of foreign states pushing for that, versus just public calls for Putin as a soiled instrument to step aside and for new leadership to emerge in Russia. It's not the same can of worms, I don't think. But keep going.
Understood. Now let's go back to these peace talks. Now, Secretary Rubio has said, look, it's not up to us to make a decision for anyone. It's our job to nudge the parties towards some sort of compromise. What does that mean?
Well, I noted that Rubio himself is not there, which speaks to the very notion that I was sort of touching on earlier, that it is more junior officials. From my perspective, I think the U.S. is a bit at a disadvantage, given that Kirill Dmitriev went to Harvard University, has a BA from Stanford, spent time at McKinsey. I'm fairly confident that none of the senior players from the U.S. side speaks Russian. None of them went to Moscow State University, GIMU, or any of the other top-tier institutions, educational institutions in Russia. That puts the Russian sort of at a better cultural knowledge of his American interlocutors. That said, spending time in a quieter city outside of a national capital may well give them space to understand each other a bit better, build some rapport that has as of yet not existed. Ultimately, I believe that the outcome should be an end of a war, but an end of a war with a lot of sticky issues, as we've already touched on. No one's willing to surrender territory, and frankly, I don't think the Ukrainians should. But how does Russia back away without losing face? And that's I think the key question at the moment.
Right. Now, the other element in this mix is, of course, the Russian state assets, the money that it has in Belgium. Now, clearly, that is something that the EU can't agree on what to do with. So, rather than release that funding for Ukrainian to help Ukraine rebuild and defend itself, it is now, the EU is now offering a €90 billion loan instead. So it's keeping its hands off Russian assets. That's playing Putin's game, isn't it?
I would certainly agree. I mean, I'm happy to see the $90 billion stopgap. This is but a Band-Aid on a wider problem. Let's set Ukraine aside. In this whole mix, Russia has consistently created costs for Europe. If we include the refugees, both out of Ukraine, but the refugees that have come out of North Africa, as Russia has consistently dialed up and then again dialed down illegal immigration from North Africa into the south of Europe, drone incursions, cyber attacks. There's a range of ways in which Russia has imposed real costs on Europe. And frankly speaking, there doesn't appear to be much resolve. I'm disappointed because I hear terms like strategic autonomy. I hear things about let's create a third pole. But at the end of the day, the Europeans don't seem to have the sand in their craw, the stomach to go ahead and say, this is our line. We're creating a consequence for you, Mr. Putin, and your allies in Russia.
Right. Well, there seems to be precious little in terms of consequences from Russia, from the European Union. Now, in terms of security guarantees, now clearly, after the Budapest memorandum was thrown away by Russia, who guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, they invaded it. What kind of security guarantees do you think Ukraine should have if it can't join NATO?
Well, this is a difficult question because Ukraine shares a very, very long border with Russia. And so creating a sort of a no conflict zone is going to require a lot of men and material, personnel and resources to protect that space if Russia is to be trusted. And frankly, I don't think it can be trusted without an outside force to prevent it from crossing over. Again, here's a question where Russia has at least wishfully attempted to limit the number of Ukrainian troops. But I think this is also a mistake. Frankly, if I'm Ukraine, I would roll back on the NATO posture and request yet again NATO membership, in so much as Russia is uncomfortable attacking Ukraine. And if you look at NATO member countries, if you look at countries like Poland, for instance, where Sikorski recently said, Poles will eat grass before we're dominated by Russia again. And Ukraine is living that out at the moment. Being part of an alliance that has membership with that attitude, I think does more to protect Ukraine than almost any other papered guarantee.
Right. Well, talking about Ukrainian membership of NATO, it's quite clear that President Trump is against that idea. And there are even concerns that the US might be planning to pull out of NATO. What do you think?
I don't think that that's realistic. I mean, we've heard this since before 2016. There is no advantage that I can see in any way, shape, or form for the United States to remove itself from NATO. Has the United States consistently, across multiple presidencies, called on Europe to spend greater monies on its own defense? Yes, there's no question about that. Have they only done so under enormous protest and with a war on their continent at their doorstep? Yes. I will stop and not go further, but would say that it's been a long time coming that European nation states have begun to spend money on their own defense, with Ukraine and Russia clearly in the frame.
And of course, many European countries have done this and are doing this as we speak. So that is a positive outcome. But in terms of boots on the ground, do you ever envisage a situation where, as part of a security guarantee force, you'd have US troops in Ukraine?
Well, let's start with European troops in Ukraine. I mean, the notion of having, a couple 100,000 European troops on rotation, being at the eastern flank of Ukraine and the Russian frontier, I have a hard time envisioning that. I mean, I see Germany as training troops. Other elements are spending more money on defense spending. Again, this in the 11th hour at the last minute, as it were. But the notion of actual troops, I have a hard time seeing the Europeans fielding troops, and I don't think that the U.S. is going to be putting large numbers of troops in Ukraine on the Russian border in the absence of Europeans. I think if the Europeans come to the table and say, we have 100,000, send 20, I think that puts the U.S. in a hard place to say no.
Right, but I mean, there is a coalition of the willing, including Britain and France, who have said that they'd be prepared to put peacekeeping troops into Ukraine. But you're suggesting, if I understand you correctly, that more countries need to pitch in. Is that right?
I'm saying that it's one thing to say you're willing to do it. It's another thing to actually begin fielding. And the numbers of troops we're talking about to protect a very large border is not going to be. It's not going to be a thimbleful. It's not going to be 10,000. It's going to be a rotational base of something numbering 100,000 people, and that has costs, very real. That has training and management costs on the nation-state level, of which Europe to date has not demonstrated it has force-worthy and ready troops ready to deploy into that sort of scenario.
Understood. Well, thank you for that, Josh. And we look forward to hearing your analysis on the outcome of these talks that are happening in the US at the moment. So see you again soon. Have a good evening.
Happy to join you when they're finished. Thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Take care.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.